Hi, I'm Greg Kilstrom, and here's a question for you. With the rush to adopt generative AI, what's the greater risk for a large enterprise, the cost of inaction or the cost of a poorly executed action? Agility requires more than just adopting new tools. It demands a fundamental shift in how teams learn, collaborate, and measure value in a rapidly changing landscape. Today, we're going to talk about what happens after the initial AI hype cycle. Many organizations have invested in powerful new platforms, but the real challenge isn't procurement, it's enablement. How do you move AI from a series of isolated pilot projects to a core capability that empowers your teams, enhances creativity, and drives measurable business outcomes without introducing unnecessary risk? To help me discuss this topic, I'd like to welcome Prince Boucher, head of Forward Deployed Creatives at Luma. Prince, welcome to the show.
Hey, what's up, Greg? Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Looking forward to talking about this. I mean, definitely a timely topic here. Many are grappling with. Before we dive in, though, why don't you give a little background on yourself and your role at Luma?
Yeah, definitely. So I've been at Luma just about almost 18 months. My background spans across film development, talent management, used to manage musicians, content production, content strategy, growth marketing, and go-to-market strategy. I've been in startups probably the past 12 years. I kind of a startup junkie. Started in film development and entertainment media, and then kind of jumped into the ad agency world. And then I've been in-house in brands and startups for the past 12 years.
Yeah, wow.
And And then over at Luma, basically head up for Deployed Creative, which is a role we created based on the pain points for enterprises around adoption, enablement, and expansion. And essentially our goal is to transform how creatives work across organizations.
Great. And yeah, I do want to talk a little bit about, you mentioned your title, but, it sounds quite specific. So, can you talk a little bit more about, how that relates to your role on the front line with clients and maybe how that ties back into Luma's mission?
Yeah, definitely. So, Luma's mission is to pioneer an intelligent creative infrastructure layer powered by unified intelligence. So it's a system where reasoning, imagination, and execution operate simultaneously, sort of like the human brain, right? So left and right brain coming together. And so the FDCs, much like FDEs, the forward deployed engineers, we call them the forward deployed creatives, they essentially bridge the gap by embedding creative technologists inside brands, agencies, entertainment studios. And so instead of just handing, these AI tools to clients, the FDCs essentially help them fundamentally change how they work, reducing the cognitive overhead of tiny tasks so teams can focus entirely on elevated creative potential. A big thing with AI tools is the adoption within organizations, that being how much % of the organization uses them, but how do the tools actually embed in their workflows and how do they translate traditional workflows to current workflows?
Yeah. Well, and I think that's where, I wanted to start talking at the strategic level as well. And I think that ties into what you just said. And, I think we're moving past some orgs are still in the AI experimentation phase, let's say, but I think many are trying to at least move beyond isolated AI experiments and have a more cohesive way that they approach, everything from, creative to other things. We'll focus a little more on the creative aspect here. But when you see an organization trying to take that step, what's the strategic framework that they need to put in place? Are there some, essential like pillars or something that an AI enablement strategy really requires?
Yeah, no, great question. So, I started my career in digital transformation. I was one of the first digital strategists in Hollywood and then as well in the ad agency world. And so I think at the high level, it needs to come from the top, right? So leaders, they kind of need to abandon that patchwork approach of stitching together all these different fragmented single-use cases. And so, single-use models essentially. And so we kind of think about it in three ways. The first is a unified infrastructure. So that's adopting a unified intelligence architecture. That essentially reasons before it renders. Right now, a lot of the tools are a fragmented sense of tools. And so that's just really hard to get into a flow to distribute that across the organization. So we're really trying to, create one central location. The second is embedded expertise. And so that's where the FDC model comes in place. So we use this, very high touch FDC model to operationalize the technology. And so these are individuals with a background. Of course, they're creative technologists at the core, but they came as experts whether in entertainment to animators to videographers to content creators, but also, have a high level strategy of how to adopt these tools.
Yeah.
And then the last is the human direction, right? It's empowering the best creative minds, not technical prompt engineers, just to direct the AI. This is like moving past the, maybe the pilot stage to achieve real scale that requires AI and basically to act as more of your creative partner. And so this is not just generational tools, that's more transformational tools.
Yeah. And I think what enterprises and others, but what enterprises I think quickly understand about a lot of different siloed efforts and one-off things is that, I feel like we learned how to make consistent brands years and years ago in the non-AI world, right? So, not every brand was 100% consistent, but there were ways of managing that and doing that. Sometimes I feel like we're having to learn some of that stuff all over again, or maybe some brands didn't codify some of those things in the right way. So, governance and brand safety are certainly, they've always been concerns, but I feel like AI is kind of opening up a new way of looking at it from both a good and a way that needs more governance, let's just say. How do you advise leaders to balance that? Because AI also opens up huge opportunities that never existed before. So, how do you advise leaders to balance that need for creative freedom and the greater, in some cases, potential with, that requirement that they've always had, which is that brand control and risk mitigation?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's actually becoming a bit easier, right? I think, right, when you're in Figma and you're in the traditional tools, right, there's this of course, human oversight is super important. But now I think the possibility, if you use Claude Code or, and you create an agents.md file or skills files, that is being introduced now in this creative renaissance, right? Through tools like Luma, where control is achieved by using an architectural framework that understands your intent. And so, if you're using our app, for example, if you have these set parameters, they're essentially, thumbs upping and thumbs downing depending on what's coming about in the generation. So, and because, our Uni 1 model performs structured internal reasoning before the image synthesis, it resolves these constraints and plans compositions rather than just guessing. So I think, in the early phases of generation, it was just kind of randomization and called the slot machine problem.
Right.
And so we've focused on really trying to solve those problems. And so we advise these leaders to position the human as the indispensable director. You have to really set this system. And then by pairing this unified system with an expert human oversight, brands can rapidly iterate without sacrificing craft or brand integrity, much like how, we helped Mazda with their first AI-produced commercial with full brand compliant in under 2 weeks. And so, essentially they were trying to keep, I'm not sure if you saw the commercial or not, but it goes through, I think, dozens of years and trying to keep the composition of each specific car. And, in the auto industry, it's very particular in how it looks, the color. And then, of course, we had to keep the era in which, from the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, everything from style and clothes. And so, the technical thing, if we're going to go to, right to the bottom of how this happens, we create these lookup tables and we also automate those. So you kind of just have to set it and forget it. And then, but that all comes down to art direction and creative direction, right? But once you have that in what we call boards, then it creates consistency across all your generations going forward.
So I know you talked a little bit about the process there, but I did want to get a little more into that as well. And, you mentioned, some of the, at least initial exploration of generative AI, is a little hit or miss with some of the, some of the results not being as consistent as it sounds like they're able to be with a little more governance and direction. From your perspective, the creatives then on the team, given that there are guardrails in place and there's systems and some of these things being codified, what does the role of the creative in this process look like? And are there skills that either are less necessary or new skills that are more necessary in this in this newer process?
I mean, I think it's the same time tail of transition of new tools and technology, right? Whether that is, illustrators going to Illustrator, right? Or, vinyl DJs going to, the digital down and producers. And so I think the core skills are still the most important things, right? Knowing how to draw is super important. especially if you're, doing generative, like you can now draw and illustrate your thing and then you can animate it. And
Mm,
so I
yeah.
think the learning a new tool is definitely, I think, the new thing, but you can't replace like traditional skill sets of, drawing, storytelling, and taste. And
Yeah.
so I think the new process removes like menial execution, but it definitely elevates like high level direction. And so, I don't think generative AI, it's not a replacement, but it's an augmentation tool. And, I've been in machine learning and AI for the past decade. And I remember right in the beginning, there was AI and then there's always this word IA, and it was intelligence augmentation.
Mm,
Right. And so it's like
yeah.
this hybrid centaur, metaphor, which I really relate to.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
as a result of this, right, I think, as I mentioned, taste becomes most critical. The most discerning creatives with a deep understanding of aesthetics, cinematography, and lighting become infinitely more valuable.
Mm.
And their role shifts to providing the internal spark, curating possibilities, and, refining the final product. So
Yeah.
I'm excited about that.
I mean, it seems like, in that description, I totally agree. You're able to, because you're not in the weeds trying to create something technically, so the AI is taking care of some of those details. You're able to actually focus on the things that matter, right? I mean, that's what it seems like, at least.
Yeah, I mean, some two end like stories and the best part of the job is I get to work with these incredible creatives who have a deep background in their skills and crafts, but then also our partners, and, hearing their stories and how it's changing their work. And so,
Yeah.
two quick stories, like one, Robert Rodriguez, the film director,
Yeah.
Spy Kids and Desperado, one of my favorite films. Which I didn't realize was a cartoonist when he was growing up. And
Oh, really?
so,
I didn't know that.
that's how he cut his teeth, doing comics in Texas. And he discovered the tool recently, and he took all his old artwork and he's been, bringing them into Luma and essentially being able to transform them into where he's talking about, well, in the past, 20 years working in VFX and animation, he would take his drawings and he would give them to an animator and they couldn't translate his work.
Yeah.
And now he's like, he's bringing a tool and now he's able to accelerate, his abilities as a drawer where he's like, I could draw from this perspective, but I can't draw from this perspective. And now it's like able to see, and,
Wow.
see the work and translate that. He's showing his kids the work and they're like, wait, Dad, is that you? And so that's
Nice.
like
Nice.
really cool. And then
That's
on the
amazing.
other side, John Irwin from Wonder Studios, we did the partnership with them and he just did the Moses show on Amazon with Amazon Studios. And the ironic thing that I heard, the biggest takeaway from that was that he got to spend 30% more time with Ben Kingsley on his performance. And so when you think about AI bringing you closer to the human performance, like that's just like stuff I don't think most people expect to hear.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I totally agree. And I think, I think it's amazing when people are able to kind of wrap their heads around that and see it. And I think, some of that just goes down to some of us. I think in some ways I gravitate towards I'm just going to jump in and try things out. Not in everything in life, but certainly with AI and some of these other things. But, others maybe a little more reluctant. I know some of this is a big change to a lot of people that have been doing things the same way for a while, and maybe they don't see some of those benefits. What have you seen from, even from a tactical approach to help people kind of get more excited or really understand the potential of this technology, who may be a little more reluctant to try it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so the FDCs came out trial and error. Initially it was like, okay, well, let's make some YouTube videos and let's do some webinars.
Yeah.
And I think that was helpful to a certain extent. But at the end of the day, identifying talent on the FTC side that people can connect to. And so especially if we're working with a brand, a creative director that came from an agency really relates to their experience. And so, our most effective approach is deploying these, aligned creatives who can see each other to basically guide and transition very, very much hands-on. Tactically, you got to position AI as a tool that reduces the menial labor rather than a threat to jobs.
Yeah. Yeah.
And by proving that this unified intelligence that we're creating can level the playing field, allowing creators to execute ambitious, complex ideas that budget or technical constraints previously made impossible. And so, Dream Brief is a perfect example that we launched at Cannes. And so now teams quickly embrace it as an amplifier of their own vision. So I think when you have someone who has been in the same room as them to show them tools and someone they might respect, really helps, I think, guide that path.
And then, let's talk a little bit about, how do you put measurement to some of this, some of the things that you talked about, I think it's hard to quantify the extra time you get to spend with talent to coach them and all that, or even, being able to do some things that you couldn't previously do. But, how should organizations look at measuring impact and things like that from adopting these types of tools?
So yeah, it's basically a direct line to the bottom line that can be seen in compressed production timelines and expanded capabilities. And so an example is our partnership with Boundless, which allowed them to take the Mazda MX-5 commercial from brief to final approval in under 2 weeks. And that enabled smaller teams and independent agencies to take on massive creative ideas, but without inflating budgets.
Yeah. Wow. That's the time alone to do that is pretty compelling story there. So, I want to talk a little bit about moving forward and future stuff. It's hard to anticipate exactly what's going to happen even tomorrow, but certainly there's new models coming out every week from the different providers. There's new technologies. How does an enterprise position itself to be adaptable and as much as can be future-proof when they're thinking about adoption of these types of creative tools and AI models and platforms?
Yeah. There's a couple things there, right? So I think enterprises have to realize that the current industry approach of using separate models for text, vision, and video is basically plumbing, and it's kind of a dead end. And to future-proof this, like programs should be built on a sense of unified intelligence, a single architecture that jointly models time, space, and logic. I think you got to adapt by investing in systems that are charting the course towards multimodal AGI rather than tying workflows to today's fragmented chatbots. I think another thing, what separates us from a bunch of like aggregators and is that, we're building, a center, right? We're building a data center. And so compute and competing for compute is also a big thing.
Yeah.
And so I think this stuff takes a lot and deep effort versus just, of course, we're building a product, but there's a lot more than that. And so I think investing in a long-term partner is probably the way to go for enterprises. I think if you are maybe a creator or maybe not thinking about, the next like 5 to 10 years, that might be a different decision. But I think for large enterprises, finding a long-term partner is someone you want to think about.
Yeah. And then, it seems like that delta between those that are still, let's call it more in the ad hoc world of trying a bunch of different things, but not really successfully integrating AI from an operational standpoint. What do you see that's really going to separate those orgs that are doing it right, that are really doing kind of some of the things that you just said versus those that are still kind of scattershot?
Yeah, definitely. I think taking deep bets in certain areas, right? So for us, professional creatives, right? Like obviously everyone is a creative and there's different ranges of profession, but like, we're thinking about hybrid production extremely deeply. That's why we were one of the first to launch the video to video model, which you can, which essentially is pioneering this performance capture. The winners will be the organizations that avoid generating generic AI by leveraging AI as a professional grade instrument for taste. They'll value consistency, deep integration, a real world usability over novelty. Ultimately the organizations that succeed will be the ones that realize AI should make the human creator more indispensable than ever. And that's how we're thinking about it.
Love it. Well, Prince, thanks so much for joining today. Got 2 last questions as we wrap up here. First one, if we were having this interview 1 year from today, what is one thing that we would definitely be talking about?
So we already started talking about one, so I'll go to 2. So taste, I think that won't go away for a while. And then 2, robots.
Got it. Nice. Awesome. Well, let's have this conversation again and talk about both. Love it. And then last question for you. What do you do to stay agile in your role and how do you find a way to do it consistently?
Yeah, definitely. Maybe these are non-traditional answers one's definitely very traditional. I read quite a bit, and that's everything from like classic books, right? Like literature to like field guides, understanding traditional craft and format of all kinds, I think is super helpful, especially being in the creative field. Like how have people been doing it time over time and how did people make those transitions? I was just like, I'm in London at the Tate and was looking at, one of these galleries where during the Warhol era where, artists are always examining commercial work and So there's one exhibit where essentially like it made me think of generative AI because they took every single advertisement and created essentially a collage. And so it was almost like forecasting this idea of abstraction and representation of the real world. I think the more we understand the origins of work, the more we can understand how to transform how work is done. So, yeah.
Great. Well, again, I'd like to thank Prince Boucher, head of Forward Deployed Creatives at Luma, for joining the show. You can learn more about Prince and Luma by following the links in the show notes. Thanks again for listening to the B2B Agility Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please take a minute to subscribe and leave us a rating so that others can find the show more easily. You can access more episodes of the show at www.b2bagility.com. That's b2bagility.com. While you're there, check out my series of best-selling Agile brand guides covering a wide variety of marketing technology topics, or you can search for Greg Kihlstrom on Amazon. Until next time, stay focused and stay agile.
The Agile brand.